Peru's Prosecutor's Office opens preliminary investigation of high-level police commanders for arbitrary detentions in Lima. In France, tensions escalate as public workers strike against the government's pension reform continue. Main trade unions are calling for new mobilizations. And Syria received Venezuelan shipment of humanitarian aid after deadly earthquakes. Hello, welcome to From the South. I'm Luis Alberto Matos from the teleSUR studios in Havana, Cuba. We begin with the news. Peruvian Prosecutor's Office opened a 60-day preliminary investigation of high-ranking police officers for arbitrary detentions of students in Lima. The government office informed that the investigations against high commanders of the National Police of Peru will be led by the 4th Corporate Criminal Prosecutor's Office of Lima under the charge of abuse of authority. The Prosecutor's Office also indicated that the accused will be investigated for the death of demonstrators Victor Santiesteban, who was hit in the head by a tear gas bomb. Meanwhile, the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights urged Dina Boluarte to be accountable for the police raid into the University of San Marcos after the denunciations of abuse of force against its students. Brazilian President Luis Inácio da Silva travels to Washington on Thursday to put Brazil's relationship with U.S. counterpart Joe Biden back on track after it was disrupted during the mandate of far-right former President Jair Bolsonaro. Almost a month after assuming his third term as president, Lula will be received by Biden on Friday afternoon at the White House. The most remarkable thing about the visit is its political character, the symbolic fact that it occurs at the beginning of President Lula's term in office, said Michel Arslanian Neto, head of the Latin American and Caribbean Department of the Brazilian Foreign Ministry. According to the White House, Biden and Lula will address strong U.S. support for Brazilian democracy and common challenges such as climate change, food security, economic development, strengthening peace and security, and regional migration. In Brazil, President Lula da Silva described as irrational and treasonous the privatization of Eletrobras, an action undertaken during the Jair Bolsonaro administration. President Lula instructed to launch an investigation into the matter. According to the Brazilian head of state, a review of the terms of the privatization contract for the largest electricity company in Latin America will be requested. In this sense, he detailed that in spite of owning 40% of the shares, the Brazilian government has a highly restricted degree of participation in the company's management. On the other hand, Lula refused to accept terminations made against Eletrobras and affirmed that the previous government undertook actions to the detriment of the Brazilian people. The Dominican Medical Association leads a march on Wednesday in the province of Barahona to protest against the health risk insurance companies as part of the demands for reforms in the Social Security system. The president of the National Social Security Council, Dr. Senen Cava, emphasized that workers demand a Social Security system that compensates the population with a health plan that at least approaches the 70% of coverage established by law. At the same time, the doctors denounced that the authorities ignored the request to increase the $142 quota for the purchase of medicines, as well as the request to include patients with mental disorders and disabilities in the coverage. The Dominican Teachers Association, the Enriquillo Coalition, the University Employees Association, and the Federation of Dominican Students, among other unions, take part in the march. The International Committee of the Red Cross warned that more than 3 million Haitians are in dire humanitarian need amid the Caribbean nation's multidimensional crisis. The organization assured that the extent of suffering in the Caribbean nation is alarming due to the fact that the population is going through various crises, including repeated cycles of armed violence causing devastating effects. The committee also pointed out that in several areas the needs are critical due to the limited access to food, healthcare, and water. In this regard, the Red Cross called for an increase in collective efforts to respond to the emergency situation and long-term development needs. In Ecuador, social and indigenous organizations demanded respect for the popular will expressed in the sectional elections and referendum proposed by the Lasso government. At a press conference, the Indigenous Peoples Federation of Ecuador rejected the recounting of votes that has begun in 6 provinces. The federation also pointed out that the rejection of the referendum promoted by Guillermo Lasso was the result of the struggle of Ecuadorians in the streets and of those affected by neoliberal policies. The indigenous movement also rejected the call for dialogue made by the Ecuadorian president. On Wednesday, Ecuadorians continue to await the final results of Sunday's elections, while citizens warn of the possible manipulation of the electoral records. The National Electoral Council informed issues with the printing of official documents forced a recount in 6 provinces of the country: Zamora, Chinchipe, Morona, Santiago, Napo, Cañar, Loja, and Santa Elena. In view of this situation, social sectors expressed concern about the possibility of the referendum promoted by the executive. So far, with more than 98% of the records processed, in all questions the no vote seems to be irreversible and constitutes a setback for the government of Guillermo Lasso and the far right. The governing body of the elections affirmed that the complete scrutiny may take up to 10 days after the elections are over. Let's take a short break, but first remember you can follow us on TikTok at the account at teleSUR English, in which you will be able to see news in different formats, news updates, and much more. All the stories coming up. Stay with us. Welcome back from the South. The U.S. prevented the entry of over 4,000 kilograms of fentanyl into its territory, according to what Tim Burchett, a member of the U.S. House of Representatives, reported on Tuesday. 3,265 kilograms of the synthetic narcotic opioid were seized at the country's southern border. According to the U.S. Drug Enforcement Administration, a dose of just 2 milligrams is considered potentially lethal, making fentanyl a drug 50 times more potent than heroin and 100 times more potent than morphine. More than 379 million potentially deadly doses of the substance were seized last year alone, enough to kill every U.S. citizen, the Bureau said in December. According to the U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, nearly 107,000 U.S. citizens died as a result of an overdose in 2021, indicating a 16% increase from 2020, and the main cause was consumption of fentanyl. On Wednesday, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky requested the UK Parliament once again for fighter jets to fight against Russia. During his first visit to the United Kingdom since the start of the armed conflict on February 2022, Zelensky made the request while addressing the British Parliament and proclaimed that Russia will lose the war. He also emphasized the importance of the artillery and air defense coalition to stop the Russian military offensive. In this context, with the slogan "Planes for Ukraine, Wings for Freedom," the president pointed out the need for the Western powers to provide fighters and additional support to defend themselves in the air.
I trust this symbol will help us for our next coalition of the planes, and I appeal to you and the world with simple and yet most important words: combat aircrafts for Ukraine, wings for freedom.
In France, tensions escalate in the midst of the public workers' strike against the government's pension reform, while the main trade unions are calling for new mobilizations. Several unions, among them the General Labor Confederation, as well as the transportation sector and the energy companies, decided to maintain the strike, which began on Tuesday. These actions are part of the pressures against the government for the retirement system reform project, which includes the extension of the legal retirement age from 62 to 64 years, the increase of the contribution period, and the elimination of special pension systems. Demonstrators called on deputies and senators to reject this bill on the third day of debates in Parliament. Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov pledged military support to Mali during his first visit to the West African nation. Russia's top diplomat met with Mali's military junta leader, Colonel Assimi Goïta, at the Koulouba presidential palace Tuesday. Lavrov told journalists that Russia has delivered very large supplies of aviation equipment to Mali over the past few months, which has significantly increased the capability of local forces to fight extremists and dismissed criticism of Moscow's growing influence on the continent. The Russian diplomat's trip to Bamako, Mali's capital, comes as Western countries express their concerns about alleged human rights abuses committed by Russian private military Wagner Group in Mali. South African President Cyril Ramaphosa delivers annual State of the Union on Thursday as 60 million people without electricity for months hope to hear the head of state address the energy crisis in his speech. The ceremony, which is usually conducted with great pomp and circumstances at Parliament, will be held this time at the Town Hall building, in an economic and social context which calls for sobriety. South Africa is plagued by one of the highest unemployment rates on the planet, and GDP growth forecast for the year of almost zero, and families crushed by the constant rise in the price of basic commodities and anger at power shortages. At the call of the opposition and trade unions, demonstrations have broken out in the past weeks in several cities, including Johannesburg. We have more news coming up after a fun short break. Don't go away. Welcome back to From the South. A Venezuelan shipment of humanitarian aid arrived in Syria after the earthquake that devastated the Arab nation last Monday. 20 firefighters and 5 experts from the Venezuelan Foundation for Seismological Research, FUNVISIS, arrived in the country to assist in the rescue operations. This is the first shipment of humanitarian assistance from Latin America to Syria. Damascus denounced the attitude of Western nations in obstructing rescue actions and attention to the Syrian victims of the earthquake of magnitude 7.8. Damascus announces that the blockade and sanctions imposed by the United States and the European Union are preventing medicines and humanitarian aid from reaching Syria following the devastating earthquake which struck last Monday. February 6. This is an altitude that is exacerbating this tragedy of the Syrian people who are struggling with. Welcome back to From the South. A Venezuelan shipment of humanitarian aid arrived in Syria after the earthquake that devastated the Arab nation last Monday. 20 firefighters and 5 experts from the Venezuelan Foundation for Seismological Research, FUNVISIS, arrived in the country to assist in the rescue operations. This is the first shipment of humanitarian assistance from Latin America to Syria. Damascus denounced the attitude of Western nations in obstructing rescue actions and attention to the Syrian victims of the earthquake of magnitude 7.8. Damascus announces that the blockade and sanctions imposed by the United States and the European Union are preventing medicines and humanitarian aid from reaching Syria following the devastating earthquake which struck last Monday, February 6. This is an altitude that is exacerbating this tragedy of the Syrian people who are struggling with all the means at their disposal to overcome the tragedy that the country is currently experiencing. From this country, our correspondent Hisham Wanus adds to the information.
The terrorist war imposed on Syria has led to the destruction of the infrastructure and the loss of more than 50,000 vehicles, which Syria now needs to cope with the disaster caused by the earthquake. This is what the Syrian Minister of Local Administration has said, claiming that Western sanctions are preventing the country from compensating for the lack of vehicle that would have made it possible to deal with the aftermath of the earthquake.
The priority now is to remove the debris to save lives, and we have managed to save a large number of citizens trapped under the rubble thanks to the efforts of all parties involved and the rapid response with the available capacities of both government institutions and civil society.
In defiance of these sanctions, which they describe as inhumane, many Arab and foreign countries sent civil protection teams and aid planes to Syria to help alleviate the suffering of the Syrian people. At the same time, there was an outpouring of social solidarity with the victims, with national campaigns to give blood for the wounded and collect donations for families who had lost their homes.
We help each other without expecting others to help us, and I really wish now that in addition to donating blood, I would be with my fellow Syrians in the affected areas to help rescue those trapped under the rubble. As much as we are offering help, we feel it is not enough.
In the midst of these difficult circumstances that we are going through, we demand the lifting of sanctions in order to facilitate the arrival of aid to our country to alleviate the suffering of our people as a result of the earthquake that has made our suffering even more acute.
We're suffering from an unjust blockade, and in these difficult conditions, we have no choice but choosing social solidarity and try to offer as much help as we can. Whether it is material help, financial help, or blood donations for the wounded, and everyone can offer what they can to help all the brothers in the disaster areas.
Meanwhile, national rescue teams are working against the clock to save the lives of those trapped under the debris, a huge task they are undertaking tirelessly with the help of volunteers, Syria's and Russia's troops, and rescuers from many countries around the world. The number of collapsed buildings now stands at 102 in the coastal province of Latakia and 54 in Aleppo. Entire neighborhoods have been evacuated for fear of collapse as aftershocks from the region's strongest earthquake in decades continue.
Hisham Wannous, teleSUR, Damascus, Syria.
Contrary to early reports from Newcastle United winger and Ghana international Christian Atsu is yet to be rescued from the rubble of the earthquake that devastated Turkey and Syria on Monday. Despite initially reassuring information, relatives of the Ghanaian footballer told the press on Wednesday they still had no news of the player. The Ghanaian embassy in Ankara and the Ghana Football Federation had assured on Tuesday that the attacker had been found alive in the rubble of a collapsed building. The 31-year-old joined the Turkish club Hatay Sport in September, based in the province of Hatay, near the epicenter of earthquake. According to the latest official reports released on Wednesday, over 11,000 people have been reported dead and thousands injured in Turkey and Syria as a result of Monday's quake. New groups of specialists from Mexico and Colombia arrived in Chile today to help contain the forest fires in the center-south of the country. The fires have already devastated more than 290,000 hectares. The Mexican contingent from the National Forestry Commission, experienced in dealing with similar emergencies in Central America and Canada, will be sent to the Araucanía region. The group brings to 300 the number of experts sent by the government of Andrés Manuel López Obrador to Chile to respond to the disaster, which has left 24 dead, around 2,000 injured, and over 1,500 homes destroyed. Also, in the last few hours, a cargo plane from Colombia arrived in Chile with 20 brigadiers, 4 communication specialists, 2 paramedics, and a coordinator on board.
We will do our best to work with the Chilean brigades, who have been working for so many days, who are so exhausted, and who have been doing an excellent job since the beginning of the catastrophe.
Accompany the 150 brigade members who arrived from Mexico yesterday and today are already leaving to work in the area of Santa Juana, which is one of the areas most in need of support. It is a mission of 300 brigade members who go to the field, primarily to places where sometimes planes, helicopters, and even vehicles cannot reach. So that is the intention of the Mexican contingent.
We have come to the end of this news briefing. You can find these and many other stories on our website at telesurenglish.net. You can also join us on social media, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Telegram, and TikTok. For TeleSUR English, I'm Luis Alberto Matos. Thank you for watching.